Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. My name is Edsel De Jesus, candidate number 7007, and alongside my team members Gustavo, Marcos, and Benjamin, we explore the global issue of homelessness, specifically the factors that cause homelessness. So, to understand this issue, we first need a clear definition of what homelessness is. Homelessness refers to individuals lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. While this is the most widely accepted definition, it's important to recognize that definitions do vary internationally depending on social policies and welfare structures. Now, according to the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD for short, homelessness includes four major categories: literally homeless individuals, those at imminent risk of homelessness, individuals qualifying under other federal statutes, and those fleeing from domestic violence. Now, the global prevalence chart shown here demonstrates that homelessness exists in every society, but its severity often depends on how effectively governments address poverty, housing, and social protection systems. And I want to quickly evaluate these sources. The Department of Housing and Urban Development is one of the most authoritative U.S. government sources for defining and categorizing homelessness, and it's highly credible due to its official role in federal housing policy. However, its definitions are U.S. specific and may not fully align with how homelessness is defined globally. Statista is useful for presenting comparative global data visually, making it effective for audience understanding. However, because it's a secondary source, the original data should be consulted for full reliability. So why does this issue matter? Well, physically, homeless populations face increased exposure to disease, malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and significantly higher mortality rates. Without stable housing, even basic healthcare becomes difficult to access. Mentally and emotionally, homelessness often leads to depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance dependency, and loss of self-worth. Socially, homelessness increases vulnerability to assault, criminal justice involvement, and long-term behavioral issues, particularly among youth. Now, the CDC emphasizes that structural barriers like limited healthcare access, poverty, and unstable environments often worsens these outcomes dramatically, which means that homelessness is not only an economic issue, but also a public health and societal issue, affecting communities through increased healthcare costs, crime, and reduced social mobility. Now, the CDC is a highly credible government health agency, making it an excellent source for explaining the physical and mental consequences of homelessness, since its data is reliable and evidence-based. And the Coalition for the Homeless of Central Florida source is valuable because it provides local context specific to Orlando and Florida. But however, as an advocacy organization, it may emphasize the severity of homelessness to support its mission. So homelessness is caused by multiple overlapping factors, but our group decided to focus on housing problems, economic inequality, psychological issues, and mass incarceration. My focus will be on economic inequality because financial instability often acts as the catalyst that transforms vulnerability into homelessness. Economic vulnerability is particularly dangerous because it affects millions who may appear financially stable but lack emergency resources. And so this perspective is critical because while housing shortages matter, financial collapse is often what pushes individuals into homelessness in the first place. So locally, looking at Florida, the data reveals how homelessness is rapidly increasing. Over 31,000 Floridians experienced homelessness in 2024, with more than 42,000 entering homelessness, while fewer than 19,000 secured permanent housing, which shows that more people are falling into homelessness than escaping it. Over half of Florida's homeless population is unsheltered, meaning many live without safe shelter at all. Older adults, families with children, veterans, and chronically homeless individuals make up significant portions of this population, demonstrating how homelessness impacts diverse vulnerable groups. And these visuals show that homelessness in Florida isn't declining, but rather expanding due to rising housing costs, insufficient prevention systems, and broader financial instability. Now, the National Alliance to End Homelessness source is widely respected for homelessness statistics and policy analysis, which is useful for identifying state-level trends, though its nonprofit advocacy mission may shape how information is framed. And the Florida Coalition to End Homelessness source offers relevant Florida-specific information and visuals that strengthen local context. However, it's also advocacy-based and may selectively emphasize policy needs. So at the national level, homelessness is deeply connected to poverty and inequality. Nearly 38 million Americans live in poverty, while less than half of households have enough savings to survive 3 months without income. Additionally, millions lack credit access, creating major barriers to securing housing or financial recovery. Now, in 2024, according to a report from HUD, there was homelessness increased by over 18.1% nationwide, which was largely due to affordable housing shortages, inflation, discrimination, and weak social safety nets. And the graph shown here illustrates skyrocketing wealth among top earners, which further emphasizes widening economic inequality. And that suggests that homelessness in the United States is not merely about personal failure, but rather reflects the structural financial systems that leave vulnerable populations exposed to crises. Now, the Covenant House source is useful for illustrating how poverty and income inequality affects homelessness, particularly among vulnerable populations. Because it's nonprofit driven, it may focus heavily on advocacy perspectives. The Congressional Budget Office is a highly credible, nonpartisan government agency that provides objective economic and fiscal analysis, which is especially useful for understanding national poverty, social spending, and economic safety net structures. And obviously, the U.S. Census Bureau is highly credible because it's a federal source for poverty and demographic statistics. So globally, homelessness risk strongly correlates with the strength of national safety nets. Finland demonstrates low vulnerability through its housing first model, which guarantees permanent housing before addressing additional social issues. By treating housing as a human right, Finland has significantly reduced long-term homelessness. In contrast, the United States relies more heavily on fragmented temporary assistance, resulting in far greater homelessness vulnerability. Brazil's high income inequality limits housing stability despite social programs, while India's informal labor economy leaves millions without formal protections or reliable support systems. And this comparison shows that stronger welfare systems reduce homelessness risk, while economic insecurity and weak protections increase it. And the key takeaway is that homelessness is not inevitable, but rather heavily shaped by policy choices. So, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, is a highly credible international organization that provides strong comparative policy analysis, and its report in Finland is especially valuable for demonstrating successful homelessness prevention strategies. The Institute for Research on Poverty is a university affiliated research institute that provides highly credible and academic analyses of U.S. economic safety nets, which is especially strong for structural economic discussions. The World Bank is highly reliable for measuring inequality and poverty trends globally, which is useful for understanding Brazil's structural vulnerabilities. However, broader social and cultural factors may require supplemental sources. And the International Labor Organization is a highly credible international labor agency providing reliable employment data, which is useful for understanding India's informal economy. However, it does focus primarily on labor rather than homelessness directly. Now, across countries, financial instability often follows similar patterns, even when economic systems differ. In high income nations like the US and UK, that often stems from credit systems, medical bills, and long term borrowing cycles. In middle and low income countries like Brazil and India, unstable informal economies and predatory lending create similar financial traps. Now, despite these differences, the cycle remains consistent. Financial shock, a lack of savings, an inability to cover basic costs, and eventual housing insecurity. Now, this model I created demonstrates that homelessness often begins not with housing loss itself, but with financial system failure. Therefore, addressing economic vulnerability earlier could prevent homelessness before it begins. Now, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a highly credible government agency specializing in consumer financial systems, and its research on debt cycles is reliable and directly relevant to financial vulnerability. I already evaluated the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund is highly credible for macroeconomic analysis and debt structures, which provides strong theoretical insight into debt inequality relationships. However, it may be less focused on direct homelessness outcomes. Why isn't it moving? Okay. So my proposed solution is a financial vulnerability prevention system because rather than waiting until homelessness occurs, this model focuses on prevention through emergency financial assistance, income stabilization programs, and financial resilience education. Emergency aid could prevent temporary setbacks from becoming housing crisis, and income support programs would stabilize vulnerable workers during economic shocks, and financial education would reduce debt cycles and improve long-term resilience. And this approach addresses the root economic triggers of homelessness, making prevention more effective than reactive shelter-based systems. So evidence from around the world supports this prevention model. Finland's welfare and housing systems have significantly reduced chronic homelessness. Stockton, California's guaranteed income pilot experiment improved recipients' financial stability and employment outcomes. And Brazil's Bolsa Familia cash transfer program reduced poverty and vulnerability for millions. And these examples prove that proactive economic support can reduce homelessness risk across diverse societies. While no system is perfect, prevention consistently outperforms reactive crisis management. Now, the USA source is a peer-reviewed academic study which is highly credible and provides strong empirical evidence from guaranteed income solutions. However, its findings are based on a localized pilot program, which may limit scalability. The Brazil source is also a peer-reviewed academic article, which is highly credible and valuable for demonstrating how social welfare programs can reduce poverty and vulnerability. However, results may be context-specific to Brazil. And the Finland source is an organization that's directly involved in Finland's housing first implementation, making it highly relevant and informative. However, my solution does face some limitations, like large-scale welfare expansion can be expensive, politically controversial, and difficult to implement nationally. The pilot programs like Stockton's may succeed locally, but require substantial funding and policy coordination to scale effectively. Additionally, long-term success depends on consistent government commitment, which can fluctuate with political change, as you can see from my chart. And these barriers are significant, but they do not invalidate prevention. They just simply highlight the implementation challenges. So the Pew Research Center is a highly respected for political and social research, making it credible for discussing public attitudes toward welfare policies. And Diffin is a more general informational website and is less academically rigorous than Scholarly, but it's still useful for broad political comparisons. Still, I believe economic prevention is the most effective long-term solution because it prevents homelessness before it occurs, it reduces pressure on housing, healthcare, and criminal justice systems, which are the other causes, and it's more cost-effective than the reactive solutions. And so my conclusion, although challenges exist, prevention-based economic strategies do address the root cause of homelessness, which is the best way to deal with it. And these are all of my sources. Thank you very much for listening.